Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a giant, truly one of the cornerstones of Western literature. We're not just talking about an old poem.
No, not at all. We're diving into the very DNA of an empire, you could say, Virgil's Aeneid.
Exactly. This epic poem written, between 29 and 19 BC? It's immense, nearly 10,000 lines.
9,896 lines in dactylic hexameter, to be precise. And it's more than just a story. It was a deliberate, almost political act, linking Rome's origins directly back to the legends of Troy.
Right, and that's our goal today, isn't it? To really unpack how Virgil crafts this foundational myth, how he uses it to celebrate specific Roman virtues, and maybe most importantly, how it worked to, legitimize Augustus's new imperial power. He basically gave Rome this instant, faded history.
He absolutely did. And the structure itself is fascinating. Virgil consciously mirrors Homer. You've got the first half, books 1 to 6, covering Aeneas' long journey after Troy falls, very much like the Odyssey.
His wanderings, yeah.
Then the second half, books 7 to 12, shifts gears completely. It's all about the war in Italy, the fight to establish his people there. That's pure Iliad territory. It really announces its grand scope right from the get-go.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning then. Who was this Aeneas character before Virgil got hold of him? Because when you read the Aeneid now, Aeneas feels so inevitable, like the perfect hero chosen by destiny. But you're saying he wasn't always the central figure.
Not quite in the same way, no. Before Virgil really sculpted him, Aeneas existed in Greco-Roman legends, sure. He's even a character in Homer's Iliad. But he's, let's say, less defined. His main characteristic, even back then, was noted as this scrupulous pietas. That was his thing.
Piety or duty. We'll definitely need to unpack that concept later.
We will. But the key point here is Virgil didn't invent him out of whole cloth. He took this existing figure and massively elevated him. The basic story, Aeneas escaping Troy, seeking a new home, that myth was already floating around for centuries.
Oh, really? Who was telling it?
Well, interestingly, it seems early Greek colonists, maybe in Sicily or southern Italy, might have used it first, to connect their own settlements back to the heroic age. We even find Greek vases from the 6th century BC showing Aeneas carrying his father from Troy.
So the Greeks had him first. When did the Romans latch on to him? And why specifically a Trojan?
That's where the politics really kick in. The big shift seems to happen after Rome fought King Pyrrhus of Epirus around 280 BC. Rome was expanding fast, becoming a major player.
They needed the cultural cachet to match their military might.
Pretty much. To stand shoulder to shoulder with the ancient Greek city-states, culturally speaking, they needed an equally ancient, equally noble backstory. Adopting Aeneas, a Trojan hero, did something clever. It linked them to the Homeric world, but not as Greeks. It positioned them, in a way, as rivals or successors to the Greeks, making Rome's later dominance seem almost preordained.
Ah, I see. It's nation-building through mythology. And Virgil doesn't hide his ambition, does he? That opening line. Arma virumque cano.
Of arms and the man I sing. It's incredibly bold. It's basically saying, okay, Homer, I see your Iliad arms and your Odyssey, the man, and I'm doing both, but making it Roman.
A synthesis.
Exactly. The whole structure delivers on that promise. Books 1 to 6, the Odyssean journey, the suffering, the wandering. Books 7 to 12, the Iliadic war, the conquest, the arms.
But one big difference from Homer, maybe, is how clear the divine motivation is. Virgil pins the whole conflict right from the start on one goddess's fury.
Yes, Juno's rage. And Virgil uses mythology brilliantly here to explain contemporary Roman realities, or at least recent history. He gives us 3 main reasons for her hatred, laid out right in Book 1, in medias res in the middle of things.
Okay, what are they?
Reason 1 is the old mythological grudge. She lost the beauty contest, the judgment of Paris, to Venus, Aeneas' mother. Classic divine pettiness, you might say.
Always a good starting point for trouble.
Right. But reason 2 is directly relevant to Rome's history. Juno knows, through prophecy, that her favorite city, Carthage, which was a real rival to Rome, is fated to be destroyed by Aeneas' descendants.
Ah, so she's trying to stop the Punic Wars before they even start, mythologically speaking.
Precisely. She's fighting against Rome's destiny. And the third reason, it's personal again. The Trojan prince Ganymede was chosen by Jupiter to be his cupbearer, replacing Juno's own daughter, Hebe. A huge insult to the queen of the gods.
So it's wounded pride, political foresight, and personal jealousy all rolled into one. No wonder she's angry.
It's a potent mix, and she acts immediately. Book 1 opens with her trying to wipe out the Trojan fleet. She goes straight to Aeolus, the king of the winds.
And bribes him.
With a beautiful nymph, Deipea. A pretty standard divine transaction, really. Aeolus unleashes this horrific storm. It shows how gods can interfere even against fate's broader plan. But then another god steps in.
Neptune, god of the sea.
Yes, but interestingly, the text suggests Neptune isn't acting out of love for Aeneas. He's furious because Juno messed with his domain, the ocean, without permission.
Divine turf wars.
Sort of, yeah.
Right.
It's like even the gods have their jurisdictions. Neptune calms the storm, essentially because his authority was challenged. It's an early sign. The journey will be hellish, gods will interfere, but the ultimate path to Rome is protected by the cosmic order itself.
The destiny must unfold no matter the obstacles or the cost. So after surviving that storm, Aeneas ends up in Carthage, and eventually he tells Queen Dido his backstory. This brings us to Book 2 and the fall of Troy itself, a pivotal moment.
Absolutely pivotal. This is where Aeneas narrates the whole Trojan horse saga. The Greeks, led by Ulysses, leave this giant wooden horse, pretending it's an offering, while their fleet hides nearby. And they leave behind a very convincing liar, Sinon.
Right, Sinon spins this tale about being abandoned and the horse being sacred.
He does. But there's one Trojan who suspects foul play. The priest, Laocoon. He famously warns them, "I fear the Greeks, even bearing gifts," and even throws a spear at the horse. He wants it destroyed.
But the gods intervene again, don't they, in a really gruesome way?
Horrifically so. As Laocoon is about to perform a sacrifice, two giant sea serpents swim ashore and just devour him and his two young sons right there on the beach.
Oh, that's terrible.
It is. And crucially, the Trojans completely misread this omen. They don't see it as proof the Greeks are treacherous. They see it as divine punishment against Laocoon for daring to attack the sacred horse.
So that convinces them.
That seals it. They pull the horse inside the city walls, celebrate, get drunk, and, well, you know the rest. The Greeks climb out, open the gates, and Troy falls.
Amidst this chaos, Aeneas gets his mission.
Yes, the ghost of Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, appears to him. Hector tells him Troy is finished, he needs to stop fighting a lost cause and flee. He must carry Troy's sacred relics and its future elsewhere.
This is where that iconic image comes from.
It is. Aeneas becomes this symbol of duty, literally carrying the past, his frail, elderly father Anchises on his shoulders, and leading the future, his young son Ascanius, later called Iulus, by the hand. He tries to save his wife, Creusa, too, but loses her in the mayhem.
And finds her ghost.
He does. And her ghost confirms his destiny. She tells him not to grieve for her, that a great future awaits him in Hesperia, the land of the West, Italy, where he'll find a new kingdom and a royal wife. The message is stark. Forget personal loss. Focus on the mission.
Which makes the next part, his time with Dido in Carthage, Book 4, even more pointed and tragic. This feels like the biggest test of that mission.
It's an absolute masterpiece of psychological drama and divine meddling. Aeneas' mother, Venus, is still worried about Juno's hatred, so she decides to make Dido fall in love with Aeneas for protection.
How does she manage that?
She sends her other son, Cupid, the god of love, disguised as Aeneas' son Ascanius. While Dido is cuddling the boy, Cupid works his magic, breathing love for Aeneas into her, erasing the memory and loyalty she held for her dead husband, Sichaeus.
Wow, so Dido's love isn't entirely organic, it's divinely engineered.
Largely, yes. And Juno, seeing an opportunity not to protect Aeneas, but to trap him in Carthage and stop him reaching Italy, actually collaborates with Venus on the next step.
The two rival goddesses work together.
Briefly, for their own ends. They arrange for a sudden storm during a royal hunt. Everyone scatters, and Aeneas and Dido end up taking shelter in the same cave.
And things happen in the cave.
Indeed. They consummate their relationship. Now this is critical. Dido, perhaps influenced by the storm and the general atmosphere Juno created, considers this a marriage ceremony, a binding commitment.
But Aeneas doesn't see it that way.
It seems not. For him, it appears to be more of an interlude, a passionate one, yes, but not a formal marriage that overwrites his destiny. They live together for a while. Aeneas even helps build Carthage.
Until the gods intervene again.
Until Jupiter himself looks down, sees Aeneas dallying, as it were, and realizes the whole Roman destiny project is stalled. He sends Mercury, the messenger god, down with a very sharp reminder.
Get back on mission.
Exactly. Mercury confronts Aeneas, basically saying, what are you doing building Carthage? Remember your destiny. Remember your son Ascanius Iulus, who deserves his own kingdom in Italy.
And Aeneas just has to obey.
He has no choice. He's terrified by the divine command. His explanation to a devastated Dido is one of the most famous and perhaps coldest lines. I sailed to Italy not of my own free will. Italiam non sponte secor. Duty trumps love.
That really defines him as the Roman ideal, doesn't it? The pietas. But the cost is Dido's life.
It is. And her end is spectacular and politically loaded. Feeling utterly betrayed, her reputation ruined, she orders a massive pyre built, supposedly to burn Aeneas's belongings.
But it's for herself.
Yes. She climbs the pyre, curses Aeneas and his descendants, praying for eternal hatred between her people and his, and then stabs herself with the sword Aeneas left behind.
That curse. Rise up from my bones, avenging spirit.
Every Roman listening would have immediately thought of Hannibal and the Punic Wars. Virgil is retroactively casting Rome's most brutal historical conflict as the fated consequence of Aeneas choosing his divine duty over personal love. It justifies Rome's struggle with Carthage, but acknowledges the immense tragic price.
So Aeneas carries this guilt, this burden. Does he confront it?
He does in a way in Book 6. After leaving Carthage, he finally reaches Italy, near Cumae, and here he undertakes the classic epic journey, the descent into the underworld, guided by the prophetess, the Cumaean Sibyl,
Why does he need to go there?
primarily to seek guidance from his dead father, Anchises. But the journey itself is revealing. First, he passes through the fields of mourning, where those who died for love wander, and there he sees Dido.
Oh, wow. Does he speak to her?
He tries, he weeps, he makes excuses, says he didn't want to leave, but her shade just turns away from him, silent, unforgiving, and goes back to the shade of her first husband, Zacchaeus. It's a gut-wrenching moment, showing the permanent scars of his choices.
No reconciliation possible.
None. But the main event is meeting Anchises. This is where the poem pivots hard towards Roman destiny, Augustan propaganda.
Anchises shows them the future.
He gives them this grand vision, a parade of future Roman souls waiting to be born. He points out Romulus, the Caesars, the great heroes, and specifically Caesar Augustus.
He names Augustus.
Explicitly. Anchises calls him son of the deified, referring to the deified Julius Caesar, and prophesies that Augustus shall bring once again an age of gold to Lodium. It's the ultimate validation. All this suffering Aeneas endures. It's all leading to Augustus's glorious, peaceful reign.
That vision basically fuels him for the second half of the poem, the war in Italy.
It gives the upcoming violence a divine purpose, justifying the fight that's about to begin.
Okay, so Aeneas emerges from the underworld, armed with this vision of Rome's glorious future, and we enter the second, Iliadic half of the poem. He finally lands in Latium, his destined home.
And initially, things look like they might go smoothly. The local king, Latinus, has actually been told by an oracle that his daughter, Lavinia, should marry a foreigner, not one of the local suitors.
So Aeneas seems like the perfect candidate. Destiny aligning.
It seems so, but Juno hasn't given up. She's furious that the Trojans have reached Italy, and she still can't thwart fate completely. So she decides if she can't stop them, she'll make their arrival as bloody and painful as possible.
How does she stir things up this time?
She unleashes hell, literally. She summons Alecto, one of the Furies, from the underworld, a being who delights in causing strife and hatred. Alecto goes to work with surgical precision.
Who does she target?
3 key people. First, Queen Amatha, Latinus' wife, and Lavinia's mother. Alecto infects her with rage against Aeneas and fierce loyalty to the local suitor, Turnus.
Okay, so she turns the queen against the marriage.
Second, she flies to Turnus himself, the proud ruler of the neighboring Rutuli tribe who was expecting to marry Lavinia. She fills him with righteous fury, jealousy, and a sense of wounded honor, driving him towards war.
The jilted suitor, now enraged.
And third, and this is maybe the cleverest bit, Alecto engineers a specific incident. She guides Aeneas' son, Ascanius, who's out hunting, to shoot a deer. But not just any deer.
Oh, no. Let me guess, it was special.
It was a beloved pet stag raised by the daughter of the king's chief herdsman. It was tame, wore garlands, wandered through the community. Wounding this specific deer ignites instant outrage among the local Latins.
It's the spark that lights the fire, a small personal tragedy escalating into war.
Exactly. Virgil shows how divine malevolence exploits human emotions and seemingly small events to cause widespread conflict. War becomes inevitable.
So Aeneas, who just wants to settle down, finds himself leading a war party. He needs allies.
He does. Following advice actually from the river god Tiber himself, he sails up the Tiber River to a place called Pallanteum. This is significantly the future site of Rome.
And who does he find there?
King Evander, an Arcadian Greek who is also an enemy of the Latins. They form an alliance, and Evander does something crucial. He entrusts his own young son, Pallas, to Aeneas' mentorship and protection in the upcoming war.
Creating a really strong personal bond, like a father-son relationship almost.
Very much so. This becomes incredibly important later. Meanwhile, Venus gets involved again, naturally. She persuades her husband, Vulcan, the blacksmith god, to forge new armor and weapons for Aeneas.
Including the shield, right?
Yes, the famous shield of Aeneas,
Oh.
like Achilles' shield in the Iliad, but instead of generic scenes, Vulcan depicts the entire future history of Rome, culminating in Augustus's victory at Actium. Aeneas literally carries the burden and glory of Rome's future into battle.
That's powerful symbolism. But the war itself takes a heavy toll. The loss of Pallas. That's central, isn't it?
It's the turning point for Aeneas personally. In a fierce battle, Turnus kills the young Pallas, and not only kills him, but strips his ornate sword belt as a spoil of war, wearing it proudly.
A fatal mistake, probably.
A very fatal mistake. When Aeneas learns of Pallas's death, he goes on a rampage. But more than that, Pallas's death transforms the conflict for him. It's no longer just about securing land. It's now about vengeance for this boy he saw as a son. This loss pushes him toward that edge of furor or uncontrollable rage.
Which brings us back to pietas. We've mentioned it a lot. Let's nail down what Virgil means by it, because it's not just being religious.
Not at all. Pietas is this core Roman virtue, and it's really complex. It means something like dutifulness or respectful conduct towards several different obligations simultaneously.
Pick what?
3 main areas. First, towards the gods, that's the religious piety part, accepting fate, performing rituals. Second, towards your family, parents, children, ancestors. And third, towards your community, your people, your homeland, what would become Rome.
And Aeneas embodies all 3. That's why he's called Pious Aeneas so often.
Yes, the phrase appears something like 20 times. Religiously, his submission to Jupiter's will, even leaving Dido as the prime example. Filially, carrying Anchises from Troy is the iconic image. And societally, enduring all the suffering and fighting the war, not for himself, but to found the future nation for his descendants that bequeath us to the state.
He constantly sacrifices his personal desires for these duties.
That's the ideal. But this devotion to duty exists in constant tension with these other forces, especially fate and the actions of the gods. We need to be clear about how Virgil separates those.
Right. Fate versus divine intervention. They sound similar, but they're not the same thing in the poem.
Not quite. Fate, or fatum, is the ultimate unchangeable blueprint. It's decreed. Aeneas will reach Italy, his descendants will found Rome, and Rome will rule the world. Even Jupiter is bound by fate. Mercury explicitly tells Aeneas his son Ilus is owed the kingdom of Italy and Rome. That's fixed.
So if fate is inevitable, what's the point of Juno and Venus constantly meddling?
That's divine intervention. The gods can't change the final destination, but they can absolutely change the journey. They can throw up roadblocks, cause detours, inflict pain, delay the inevitable. Juno storms, her use of Alecto. Venus getting Vulcan to make armor these actions influence how fate unfolds, often making it much harder and bloodier.
So the gods add the drama, the suffering, the cost, even though the end result is already written.
Exactly. Their interventions test Aeneas's pietas to its absolute limit. His endurance through their meddling, while still clinging to his fated duty, is what makes him the Roman hero. He's caught between the gods' whims and fate's unyielding demands.
Okay, we can't really talk about the Aeneid without diving deep into the politics. It was written for Augustus during a very specific moment right after the civil wars had ended. You can't read it outside that context, can you?
Absolutely not. It's arguably one of the most sophisticated pieces of political justification ever written. The whole portrayal of Aeneas, this leader who is selfless, dutiful, loyal to his people, and his destiny above his own needs, it's a mirror image of how Augustus wanted himself to be seen.
The restorer of peace and traditional values after decades of chaos.
Precisely. Augustus was all about restoring mos maiorum, the ways of the ancestors, Roman virtue. And Aeneas becomes the mythological embodiment of that ideal ruler. Virgil is essentially saying, look, the ideal leader we need now, he's cut from the same cloth as our founding father.
And Virgil makes the family connection even more direct, right, through Aeneas' son.
He does. Ascanius gets the alternative name Ulysses. And Ulysses sounds an awful lot like Julius. This directly links Aeneas' lineage to the gens Julia, the family of Julius Caesar, and therefore to Caesar's adopted son, Augustus.
So it's not just saying Augustus is like Aeneas, it's saying he's his direct descendant, carrying on that fated lineage. It's divine right, essentially.
It's weaving the new imperial family directly into the fabric of Rome's oldest, most sacred myths. And then, of course, there's that explicit praise in Book 6.
When Anchises shows Aeneas the future in the underworld.
Yes. Anchises points out Augustus by name, calling him son of the deified, and flat out states he will bring back the age of gold. Couldn't be clearer. Virgil is using the voice of the revered ancestor to bless the current regime and promise stability and glory under Augustus. It tells the Roman people all the suffering, the recent civil wars included, was necessary to reach this destined golden age.
It's incredibly effective propaganda, but there's still all that violence. The poem doesn't shy away from it, even as it promises peace.
No, it's drenched in violence. From Troy's destruction to the war in Italy, violence is presented as almost necessary for survival, for conquest, for founding the state. Dido's violent end leads to her curse, foreshadowing centuries of war with Carthage. It suggests a cycle.
And that cycle seems to culminate in the poem's very final scene, the duel between Aeneas and Turnus.
That final scene is deeply troubling, and intentionally so, I think. Aeneas defeats Turnus. Turnus is wounded, helpless on the ground, and he begs for his life. He appeals to Aeneas' pietas, asking him to think of his own father, Anchises.
The ideal Roman leader, especially one embodying pietas and clemency, should spare a defeated foe, right? That was part of the Roman ideal, too.
It was, and Aeneas hesitates. Virgil shows him considering mercy. He's on the brink of showing that magnanimity. But then, he spots something.
Pallas' belt.
He sees Turnus wearing the sword belt stripped from the body of young Pallas, the boy entrusted to his care, the boy who was like a son. And seeing that trophy just flips a switch. All thought of clemency vanishes. He's consumed by furor, by blinding rage.
And the poem ends with him killing Turnus in anger.
Yes. He shouts that it is Pallas making the sacrifice, Pallas demanding vengeance. He plunges his sword into Turnus's chest, and that's it. The poem ends right there. Abruptly, violently.
What are we supposed to make of that? The great hero of Pietas ending his journey in an act of pure rage.
This is probably the single biggest point of debate among scholars. Is this a failure? Does Aeneas lose his defining virtue at the final moment? Or is Virgil showing that even the founding of a great empire, even one destined for an age of gold, is inevitably built on such brutal, perhaps necessary acts of violence?
So maybe it's a subtle critique, questioning if the peace Augustus brought could truly last, or if that underlying furor is always there.
That's certainly one interpretation, that the cost of empire, the cost of pietas even, might be a piece of one's own humanity. It complicates the straightforward propaganda message, leaving the reader with this unsettling image of the hero consumed by vengeance.
That ambiguity seems connected to another puzzle in the poem, how Aeneas gets out of the underworld.
The gates of sleep. Yes, this is another endlessly debated point. After seeing the glorious future and receiving his father's blessing, Aeneas and the Sibyl leave the underworld. There are two gates. The gate of horn, through which true shades and true dreams pass.
And the gate of ivory.
And the gate of ivory, through which, Virgil explicitly tells us, the spirits send false dreams up to mankind. And Aeneas leaves to the gate of ivory.
Why? Why have the hero, fresh from receiving the ultimate truth about Rome's destiny, exit through the gate of falsehoods?
Well, there are a few main lines of thought. One is more philosophical. Maybe Virgil is casting doubt on the literal truth of the afterlife vision, the reincarnation Anchises described. Perhaps it's meant as allegory, not factual prophecy, nodding to Platonic ideas about souls and dreams.
Okay, it's sort of intellectual skepticism. What's the other view?
The other view ties it back more directly to the politics and the ending. If Aeneas leaves through the gate of false dreams after seeing the prophecy of Rome's glory in Augustus's golden age, does that subtly undercut the prophecy itself?
Implying the promise might be illusory, or at least not the whole truth.
Possibly. Or that the path from that vision leads through falsehood, or perhaps self-deception. Given that Aeneas then immediately goes on to kill Turnus in a rage, abandoning clemency, maybe the dream of a perfectly virtuous Roman peace achieved through fated violence is itself the false dream he carries out of the underworld. It casts this shadow of doubt over the certainty of the imperial project.
It really makes you think about what Virgil might have changed if he'd lived to finish it properly.
That unfinished aspect is fascinating in itself, isn't it? Virgil worked on it for a decade, but he got sick, caught a fever on a trip to Greece, and died in 19 BC. And apparently his dying wish was for the manuscript to be burned because he felt it wasn't perfect.
He wanted it destroyed. Wow, imagine if that had happened.
It almost did. But Emperor Augustus stepped in. He clearly understood the poem's immense value culturally, politically. He ordered Virgil's literary executors, Varius and Tucca, to publish it anyway, but with minimal changes, to preserve it as Virgil left it, flaws and all.
Thank goodness for Augustus, in that sense at least. The whole course of Western literature would be different.
Completely different. Its impact was almost instantaneous. Within a century or two, the Aeneid became the central text in Roman education. Schoolboys had to memorize chunks of it. It shaped the Latin language, Roman identity.
And its influence didn't stop when Rome fell, did it?
Not at all. It remained a touchstone throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and beyond. You can see its echoes everywhere in Anglo-Saxon epics like Beowulf, in Milton's Paradise Lost, but perhaps most famously in Dante.
Right. Dante chooses Virgil as his guide through hell and purgatory in the Divine Comedy.
It's the ultimate tribute, really. Dante saw Virgil as the embodiment of human reason, classical wisdom, the master poet who understood destiny and history. Having Virgil lead him shows just how foundational the Aeneid had become, acting as this bridge between the ancient world and the Christian medieval world.
So after this whole deep dive, circling back to the beginning, what's the core takeaway? What does the Aeneid ultimately leave us grappling with?
For me, it always comes back to that fundamental tension we discussed. Duty versus rage. Pietas versus furor. Aeneas is the model of dutiful sacrifice. He gives up everything, personal love, peace, home, to follow his destiny and lay the groundwork for Rome's future greatness, for that promised age of gold.
He pays the price for pietas.
He does. But then you have that final image. The hero, consumed by vengeance, killing a helpless enemy not out of strategic necessity, but out of personal fury over Pallas's stolen belt. It shows that the violence inherent in founding an empire, even a destined one, leaves a mark. It stains the founder.
So the final provocative thought Virgil maybe leaves us with, the question that lingers long after you finish reading is, well, you phrased it perfectly earlier.
Was the cost of fulfilling Rome's glorious destiny, the price of achieving that fated empire, ultimately the loss of Aeneas' own humanity? Did the burden of pietas extinguish the possibility of mercy?
A heavy question, and one that echoes through Roman history and beyond. A fascinating look at duty, destiny, and dado. Thank you for guiding us through it.
My pleasure. It's an endlessly rewarding text.
Indeed it is. Join us next time for another deep dive.
Okay, let's dive in. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're tackling something, well, immense. A period so vast, it's almost hard to wrap your head around. We're talking about the Stone Age. That's roughly 3.4 million years of prehistory. It covers, and this is mind-boggling, something like 99% of human technological history.
That really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? It's almost impossible to overstate. When we say Stone Age, we're fundamentally talking about a time defined by one key thing: the widespread use of stone. Any kind of stone, really. Fashioned into tools, tools with an edge, maybe a point, or even just a surface for shitting things. These were the absolute basic building blocks for everything that came later.
Right, and it starts with that first, deliberately shaped stone tool. But there has been an endpoint, right? What's the big technological leap that says, okay, we're out of the Stone Age now?
Yeah, the transition point is pretty clear, technologically speaking. It's the arrival of sustained metalworking, specifically the ability to actually melt and smelt copper from its ore. That's the key.
So it's not just finding, say, a shiny nugget of gold or maybe copper and hammering it flat for an earring or something. That's still Stone Age.
Exactly. That's just working malleable metals that you find. The game changer is smelting. Building a fire or a kiln hot enough to chemically change the rock to extract pure molten copper. That's when things fundamentally shift.
Oh, okay. That changes the whole relationship with materials, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And that move, smelting copper, that's what signals the beginning of the Chalcolithic, or the Copper Age. And from there, it's a relatively quick step to the Bronze Age. Once they figure out mixing copper with tin makes it way stronger.
So our goal today is to try and map out this enormous chunk of time, this 99%. We want to give you a clearer picture, focusing on the tech, the culture, and maybe uncover some of the surprising complexity hidden there.
Precisely. Let's try and put some structure on those millions of years.
Okay, so to even begin structuring this, archaeologists lean on a pretty foundational framework, right? The three-age system, especially in places like Europe and Western Asia.
That's the classic one, yeah. It's a really useful starting point. Simple but effective. It breaks down prehistory based on the main material used for tools. So you got the Stone Age, then the Bronze Age, and finally the Iron Age.
A neat progression based on materials. But as we said, the Stone Age itself is just colossal.
Yeah.
So it needs its own breakdown, right?
Absolutely. You have to subdivide it. Otherwise, it's just this undifferentiated mass of millions of years. So we break it down into three main chunks.
Let's go through them. Where do we start?
We start at the Paleolithic. That means the Old Stone Age. And this is the big one. The vast majority of the Stone Age falls in here. It's the earliest, the longest. It covers, like you said, maybe 99% of human technological history. if we think about the genus Homo. It stretches from those very first stone tools around 2.5, maybe 2.6 million years ago, all the way up to about 10,000 BC. This is the period where our genus Homo evolves, spreads across the globe, and deals with massive ice ages.
Wow. Okay, so that's the Paleolithic. Then, after the ice ages start to recede, we get into a transitional phase.
Exactly. That's the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age. It's this crucial bridge period, roughly from 10,000 BC down to maybe 6,000 BC, give or take, depending on the region. Environmentally, this is a time of huge upheaval. The glaciers are melting, sea levels are shooting up, forests are spreading where there used to be tundra, and importantly, a lot of the big Ice Age animals, the megafauna, start disappearing.
And the tools change, too.
They do. People adapt. We see a real refinement in stone tool technology, especially the development of microliths. These tiny, sharp stone segments we'll definitely talk more about. They're a hallmark of the Mesolithic.
Now, I remember reading that in some places where farming started really early, they use a slightly different name for this phase.
That's right. In areas like the Near East, where that transition to farming, what we call Neolithization, happened very quickly, archaeologists often prefer the term Epipaleolithic. It basically covers the same time frame and adaptations as the Mesolithic, but it emphasizes that it's the period just before the Neolithic package really kicks in. It's mostly context.
Got it. And that brings us to the final stage within the Stone Age itself, the Revolution.
The Neolithic. The New Stone Age. And this one's defined less by a new type of stone tool, though there are changes there too, and more by a fundamental shift in how people lived. This is where we see the adoption of agriculture. That massive change from being mobile hunter-gatherers to settling down in villages and towns. Farming changes everything.
And new technologies come with that settled life.
Oh, absolutely. Pottery becomes essential for storing food. We see the widespread use of polished stone tools, axes, and adzes made smooth by grinding, not just chipping. Really important for woodworking and clearing land.
It's useful to remember, too, that these big archaeological ages aren't just arbitrary lines. They line up with major changes in the Earth's climate and geology.
That's a crucial point. The Paleolithic spans across the boundary between the Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs. That's a time dominated by massive ice sheets and dramatic climate swings. Then, the Mesolithic and Neolithic happen as we cross from the Pleistocene into the Holocene, our current, much warmer, more stable interglacial period.
So these hominins weren't just figuring out better tools. They were constantly adapting to entirely different worlds.
Right. It wasn't just about the stones. It was about survival in changing landscapes.
Exactly. The stones are just the clues they left behind.
Okay, so let's talk about what studying the Stone Age actually means. Because, calling it the Stone Age is convenient, but the stone tools themselves, they're just the most durable evidence we have. They're diagnostic, but they aren't the whole story.
Right. So it's not like Stone Age people woke up every day thinking, how can I improve my rock technology? They were just living, and the stones are what lasted.
Precisely. When an archaeologist labels a site Paleolithic or Neolithic, they're using the tool type as a signpost for a whole way of life. They're thinking about how society was organized, how they got food, how they dealt with the local climate, what kind of shelters they built, how they cooked, maybe even their early beliefs. The tools just help us put a date on that cultural package.
And figuring all that out from sometimes just a pile of stone flakes, that takes incredible specialization, right? How do you even start?
It really does. The core discipline here is called lithic analysis. It's a whole scientific field focused just on stone tools. It involves meticulous measurement, classifying tools by shape and size. That's typology, trying to figure out their function. But the really deep insights come from studying lithic reduction.
Lithic reduction?
Yeah.
Explain that. What does that look like in practice?
Okay, so lithic reduction is basically the science of how you get from a raw chunk of stone, like a flint nodule or a river pebble, to the finished tool. It's about reconstructing the process step by step. Archaeologists look at the scars left on the tool, the patterns of how flakes were removed, the type of hammerstone used. Even the tiny debris left behind can tell you how they did it.
And this is where those experimental archaeologists come in. The flint knappers who actually try to recreate the tools.
Exactly. Their work is invaluable. They try to replicate the techniques, and that helps us understand the choices the original tool makers made, the skill involved, even the cognitive leaps required. For instance, distinguishing between hitting a rock with another rock, that's hard hammer percussion, versus using something softer, like bone or antler soft hammer percussion.
What's the difference in the result?
Well, hard hammer tends to leave deep scars. It's less controlled. You get sharp, but maybe irregular edges.
Okay.
Soft hammer lets you remove thinner, whiter flakes. It allows for much more control, for retouching an edge to make it way sharper, more symmetrical, and longer lasting. Understanding that difference helps us track cognitive evolution.
Wow. So much information packed into tiny details on a rock.
Yeah.
And to build the bigger picture, you need help from other sciences too, right? It's not just archaeology.
Oh, absolutely not. Stone Age studies are massively interdisciplinary. You need geology to understand where the stones came from and the layers they're found in, paleontology to identify any animal bones found with the tools, what were they eating, paleoanthropology for the hominin remains themselves. Then there's palynology studying fossil pollen, which helps reconstruct the ancient environment. What plants were around, what was the climate like? And critically, physics and chemistry give us the dates through methods like carbon-14 dating for more recent stuff and potassium-argon dating for the really deep past.
So a whole team of scientists trying to understand a period named after, well, rocks. Now let's talk about the name itself, Stone Age. It was coined in Europe in the 19th century. Does it work everywhere?
That's a really important point. It works okay as a general concept, but it gets messy fast.
Yeah.
The dates for the beginning and end vary wildly across the globe. And in some places, well, the whole sequence doesn't really apply. Think about parts of the Americas or Oceania. Some groups there were using stone as their primary tool technology right up until they encountered European colonists in the 17th, 18th, even 19th centuries.
So the idea of a neat global progression, stone, bronze, iron, just falls apart.
It completely falls apart on a global scale.
Yeah.
It highlights that human development wasn't uniform, different paths, different timelines, and that brings us to a sensitive point today.
Which is?
We use Stone Age strictly as an archaeological term for prehistory. It's really important not to apply it to any living groups today. The Association of Social Anthropologists, for example, strongly advises against it.
Why is that distinction so crucial?
Because calling a contemporary culture Stone Age carries this really problematic implication. It suggests they're somehow stuck in the past, like living relics of an earlier stage that everyone else has moved beyond. It's often used in a patronizing or derogatory way, so archaeologically, fine. Describing living people, absolutely not. It's a label for artifacts and time periods, not societies.
Right. A crucial distinction. Context matters.
Always.
Okay, so we've got the standard European model, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. But you mentioned it doesn't really work everywhere. Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, needed its own system, right? Why did the European model fail there?
Yeah, it became clear pretty early on, especially to archaeologists working in southern Africa back in the 1920s, that the European sequence just didn't map onto the African evidence. The timescale in Africa was immensely deeper, and the toolkit seemed to follow different trajectories. They basically said the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic structure had no validity outside the Nile Valley.
So they came up with a parallel system for Africa.
They did. They proposed the African three-stage system. It divides the African Stone Age into the earlier Stone Age, ESA, the Middle Stone Age, MSA, and the later Stone Age, LSA. This system better reflected the major technological shifts observed in the African archaeological record.
What were the big differences driving that? Why couldn't they just adapt the European terms?
There were a couple of key things. First, the Neolithic in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa looked very different. Instead of being defined mainly by intensive farming of crops like wheat and barley, it was often characterized more by the adoption of pastoralism, herding cattle, sheep, and goats. Agriculture came later or was less central in many regions.
Okay, so a different economic base for the Neolithic equivalent. What else?
The second, and maybe even bigger issue, was the transition out of the Stone Age. In many parts of Africa, especially south of the Sahara, there wasn't really a distinct Bronze Age. Societies seemed to transition directly from using stone tools as their primary technology to mastering iron smelting. They effectively skipped the Bronze Age.
Wow, okay, so they went straight from stone to iron. That completely breaks the European model.
Completely. It means the whole technological sequence underpinning the three-age system didn't apply. So the ESA, MSA, LSA system became necessary. We can draw rough parallels for comparison, like the ESA corresponds broadly to the lower Paleolithic in time and complexity, the MSA to the middle Paleolithic, and the LSA covers the time of the Mesolithic and Neolithic, but they reflect distinct African trajectories.
This whole discussion about different systems and sequences brings up a fundamental challenge in archaeology, right? The problem of transitions. How do you show that period B actually developed out of period A smoothly?
That's a huge philosophical and practical issue. Archaeologists generally assume continuity, that changes build on what came before. But in the European Stone Age record, there often seem to be these jarring gaps. For a long time, it looked like there was a big disconnect, technologically and culturally, between the end of the Paleolithic and the start of the Neolithic in Europe.
How did they explain that gap initially?
Well, the work of people like Louis Leakey demonstrating that humanity evolved in Africa provided a potential answer for Europe. If key innovations happened in Africa and then spread to Europe via migrating populations, you wouldn't necessarily expect to find smooth, local transitions everywhere in Europe. New toolkits and lifestyles could arrive seemingly out of nowhere.
So Europe was often receiving technologies developed elsewhere. That makes sense. But it just shifts the burden, doesn't it? Now African archaeologists have to find those missing links.
Exactly. The pressure is now on the African record to reveal those gradual transitions, the steps between the ESA, MSA, and LSA, and that search for continuity has led to some interesting attempts to fill the gaps that didn't quite pan out.
You mean those intermediate periods I've read about?
Yeah, exactly. For a while, particularly after a big conference in 1955, some researchers proposed creating specific intermediate periods to bridge the major stages. They talked about a first intermediate period with toolkits like the Smith and Sangoan, supposedly linking the ESA and MSA, and a second intermediate period, including the Magosian industry, to link the MSA and LSA.
Sounds logical. Why didn't they stick?
Well, as research methods got better, especially with more reliable dating and more detailed analysis of the tools themselves, these intermediate categories started to look shaky. By the mid-1960s, they were largely rejected. It turned out that many of these intermediate assemblages were probably just mixtures of artifacts from different periods that got jumbled together at a site. Or, in other cases, like the Smith, they were likely just regional variations, what archaeologists call facies of a well-established period, like the Acheulean. They weren't distinct transitional stages, after all.
So phantoms, basically.
Yeah.
Created by the data available at the time.
Pretty much. It shows how the science evolves and corrects itself as we get more information and better techniques. The search for those true transitions continues.
Okay, let's rewind all the way back to the beginning. The lower Paleolithic, or the earlier Stone Age in Africa. We're going to the East African Rift System, Ethiopia, the cradle of Homo.
Right. And we need to picture the environment. We're talking maybe 4 million years ago, this vast savannistan ecosystem starts spreading across Africa and even into Asia. This open environment is thought to be a key factor driving bipedalism and eventually tool use. This is the world Homo erectus, the archetypal tool-equipped savanna dweller evolved in.
But before we even get to Homo erectus, what's the absolute earliest hint that someone was using tools, not necessarily making them, but using sharp rocks?
The earliest sort of smoking gun is indirect evidence. It's incredible stuff. Fossilized animal bones from the lower Awash Valley in Ethiopia dated to 3.4 million years ago. These bones have clear-cut marks on them, V-shaped grooves, and scrapes that could only have been made by stone tools.
3.4 million years ago. That's way before the accepted dates for the genus Homo, isn't it?
It is, by hundreds of thousands of years, which opens up the fascinating possibility that tool use might have originated with earlier hominins. Maybe Australopithecus, like Lucy, or another contemporary genus like Kenyanthropus. Tool use might be older than our own genus.
Wow. Okay, so that's using tools. What about the oldest actual tools we've found, the ones we can pick up and study?
Those come from a site called Lomekwi 3 in Kenya. They're called Lomekwian tools, and they date to 3.3 million years ago. Again, potentially predating Homo. They're quite large and chunky, made using fairly simple techniques.
And then comes the first really widespread, well-defined toolkit, the old one, Mode 1.
Yes, the Old One industry, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where Louis and Mary Leakey did so much pioneering work. This is what we call Mode 1 technology. The technique is often called the core and flake method. It sounds simple, and it is, relatively speaking. You take a suitable stone, usually a rounded river pebble, that's the core, and you smack it hard with another stone, the hammer stone.
And you're not really aiming for the core itself, but the pieces that fly off.
Mostly, yes. The goal is usually to detach sharp-edged pieces, the flakes. The remaining core might also be used as a heavy-duty chopper, but those sharp flakes were incredibly useful. It's basically the small flake tradition.
What kinds of tools did this produce?
Things we call choppers, discoids, polyhedrons, essentially sharp-edged rocks. They might seem crude to us, but they were revolutionary. In environments where naturally sharp rocks weren't available, being able to make a sharp edge was a massive advantage.
And we know what they use them for.
We do. There's great evidence. Residue analysis on Oldowan tools from sites like Sterkfontein in South Africa has found traces of mammalian blood cells. So definitely used for butchering animals, scavenging carcasses, or maybe humping small game. They've also found plant residues, confirming they were used for processing tough plant materials, too.
And who is making these Oldowan tools?
The classic association, especially between about 2.3 and 2.0 million years ago, is with Homo habilis, the handyman. But it's very likely they inherited the basic technique from even earlier, perhaps Australopithecines or those Lomequian toolmakers. It wasn't invented by habilis, but they certainly refined and relied on it.
Okay, so that's mode 1. Simple percussion, make a sharp edge, use it. How do we get from that to the next big step, mode 2, the Acheulean? That seems like a huge jump.
It is a huge jump, cognitively and technologically. The Acheulean industry, Mode 2, appears in Africa around 1.7 to 1.6 million years ago. The earliest well-dated examples are from Kokisalae in Kenya, and this toolkit is strongly associated with the emergence of Homo erectus.
And mode 2 is the large flake tradition, right? This is where we get those iconic hand axes.
Exactly. The hallmark of the Acheulean is the biface, most famously the teardrop-shaped hand axe. Sometimes archaeologists prefer the term large cutting tool, or LCT, and making one of these was way more complex than just banging two rocks together. It shows planning, foresight, a mental template.
How's the technique different?
Okay, so instead of just grabbing any pebble, they might start with a larger slab or nodule. They'd strike off large flakes to get a basic shape, a blank. Then comes the crucial step, retouching. They'd use that soft hammer technique we talked about, using bone, anther, or hardwood to carefully chip away small flakes along the edge. The goal was to shape the tool on both sides, that's the biface part, and so the two faces meet to form a continuous cutting edge pretty much all the way around. And often they aimed for symmetry.
So it's not just functional. There's an element of design, of standardization.
Absolutely. The Acheulean hand axe is arguably the first standardized tool in human history. You find remarkably similar ones across vast distances in Africa and later Eurasia, made over a period of more than 1 million years. It represents a major cognitive advance, the ability to hold a complex, multi-step plan in mind and execute it with skill. It's a mental blueprint imposed onto stone.
From just needing sharp to needing shaped and sharp. A fundamental shift.
A profound shift. It's the beginning of real technological design.
Okay, so we have these early toolkits emerging in Africa. Mode 1, then mode 2. This story is also about movement, isn't it? The first hominins starting to spread out from Africa. When did that happen, and what tools did they take with them initially?
The first dispersals out of Africa seem to have happened surprisingly early, and they were carried by hominins using the simpler Mode 1 Oldowan technology. Some of the earliest evidence for hominins outside Africa comes from a site called Yairn in Israel, where Oldowan-like tools have been dated to around 2.4 million years ago.
2.4 million. That's really early. That might even predate the accepted timeline for Homo erectus leaving Africa, right?
It does, by potentially 500,000 years or so. It raises the possibility that an earlier form of Homo, maybe even habilis or something we haven't identified yet, made those first tentative steps into Eurasia. It's a bit of a puzzle.
Where else do we find these very early Mode 1 tools outside Africa?
They spread quite widely over time. There are sites like Rewat in Pakistan with tools dated possibly to 2 million years ago. Renzidong in southern China also has claims for tools over 2 million years old. And critically, at Dmanisi in Georgia, we have definite Homo erectus fossils dated to about 1.75 million years ago, found alongside Mode 1 pebble tools. So erectus was definitely using Mode 1 as it moved out.
So the simple adaptable toolkit went first. When did the more complex Acheulean Mode 2 follow them out?
Mode 2 took longer to appear outside Africa. The earliest really clear evidence comes from the Levant, that land bridge between Africa and Eurasia. The site of Ubeidiya in Israel has Acheulean tools, including bifaces, dated to around 1.5 million years ago.
And Ubeidiya tells us something about how they were using these new tools, doesn't it? Were they big game hunters with their fancy hand axes?
The evidence from Ubeidiya, particularly the cut marks on animal bones found there, suggests, well, probably not yet apex predators. It looks more like they were primarily scavenging. They were likely finding carcasses of animals killed by large predators, things like saber-toothed cats, and using their bifaces, their LCTs, to quickly slice off meat and break open bones for marrow before other scavengers like hyenas arrived. The hand axe was a very efficient butchery tool for that kind of work.
Fast food, Stone Age style. Okay, so Mode 2 spreads out, but it doesn't spread everywhere, does it? So this leads to one of the big mysteries, the Movavis line.
Ah yes, the Movavis line. It's a fascinating pattern observed by archaeologist Halomovius back in the 1940s. He noticed that if you drew a line roughly through northern India, separating the West, Africa, Europe, Western and Southern Asia, from the East, East and Southeast Asia, there was a stark difference in toolkits for a very long time. West of the line, the Acheulean biface became dominant. East of the line, places like China, Korea, Indonesia, the older Mode 1 small flake tradition seemed to persist, and classic bifaces were either absent or appeared much, much later and were often different in form.
So half the old world adopted this seemingly superior Mode 2 technology, and the other half didn't. Why? That seems odd.
It is odd, and it's been debated for decades. There's no single accepted answer. One very popular idea is the bamboo hypothesis. The argument is that East Asia was incredibly rich in bamboo. Bamboo, when split, provides extremely sharp, effective cutting edges. So the theory goes, perhaps hominins in East Asia relied heavily on bamboo for many tools, knives, containers, building materials. If you have readily available, easily workable bamboo, maybe you just don't need to invest the significant time and effort required to make a sophisticated stone biface. Your simple Mode 1 flakes are perfectly adequate for preparing the bamboo you rely on.
So it wasn't that they couldn't make Mode 2, but that they didn't need to.
Yeah.
A different technological path based on available resources.
That's one strong possibility. Other theories involve things like the specific environments encountered, the types of stone available, or maybe even demographic factors. Perhaps the populations that moved east were smaller or had lost the biface making know-how. It's still unresolved.
And what about Europe? When did Mode 2 finally arrive there?
Mode 2 was relatively late getting into Europe compared to the Levant. Some of the earliest convincing sites are in Spain, like Estrecho de Quipar, dated to older than 900,000 years ago. It seems to have spread more widely after that. The latest occurrences of classic Acheulean in southern Europe, like at Fontana Ranuccio in Italy, are around 450,000 years ago, associated with a hominin called Homo saprenensis.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. We enter the Middle Paleolithic. This is Neanderthal territory in Europe and the Near East.
Right. The Middle Paleolithic runs roughly from about 300,000 years ago down to maybe 28,000 years ago in some places. The characteristic technology, especially in Europe, is the Mousterian, strongly linked with Neanderthals. Technologically, it's known for sophisticated techniques like the Levallois prepared core method, which allowed them to produce flakes of a predetermined size and shape. Very clever. But just as importantly, this is when we see really clear evidence for complex social behaviors.
Like what?
Things like definite evidence of caring for the sick and elderly. We find Neanderthal skeletons with healed major injuries that would have incapacitated them, meaning others must have looked after them. And significantly clear evidence of intentional burial of the dead, sometimes even with grave goods. That suggests symbolic thought, perhaps ritual beliefs.
And then comes the Upper Paleolithic, starting around 50,000 years ago. This is when modern humans, Homo sapiens, really spread out and take over.
Yes, the Upper Paleolithic, lasting until about 10,000 BC, is marked by us, Homo sapiens. And it's associated with a huge burst of innovation and cultural complexity. We see a rapid succession of distinct stone tool industries, much faster turnover than before. Things like the Aurignacian, Gravettian, Solutrean, and Magdalenian cultures in Europe.
And it's not just stone anymore, is it?
No, far from it. There's a massive increase in the use of bone, antler, and ivory for tools, things like barbed harpoons, spear throwers, and eyed needles, suggesting tailored clothing. And of course, an explosion in art and ornamentation, beads, pendants, figurines, and those incredible cave paintings.
Can you give an example of that technological refinement? Like the Solutrean.
Oh, the Solutrean is stunning, flourishing around 22,000 to 17,000 years ago, mainly in France and Spain. They perfected pressure flaking. Instead of hitting the stone, they used a tool to apply precise pressure to detach tiny flakes. This allowed them to create these incredibly thin, beautifully symmetrical, leaf-shaped points, often called laurel leaf or willow leaf points. Some are so delicate they might have been ceremonial rather than functional. It's real artistry in stone.
Amazing. And this period of rapid innovation is when modern humans complete their global journey.
Pretty much. We see modern humans reaching Australia probably between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. The famous Mungo Man burial in Australia dates back about 42,000 years. And then the last great continental colonization, the Americas. Paleo-Indians migrated across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia likely around 15,000 years ago, or perhaps even earlier, spreading rapidly south. The Clovis culture, known for its distinctive spear points, appears around 13,500 years ago, marking a well-established presence. Humanity had finally gone global.
Okay, so the glaciers have retreated. The world is warming up as we enter the Holocene epoch. This brings us back to that transitional period, the Mesolithic, roughly 15,000 to maybe 9,000 years ago. It's a time of profound adaptation.
Yeah, the environment is changing dramatically. Sea levels rising, drowning coastal areas, forest spreading, and those huge ice age animals. They're disappearing. It's a massive extinction event, really. The first Holocene extinction. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant deer, cave bears, they vanished from Eurasia. Giant sloths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats disappeared from the Americas. This must have forced a radical shift in hunting strategies and diet for humans. They couldn't rely on tracking massive herds anymore.
So they had to get better at hunting smaller game, fishing, gathering plants, more intensive use of local resources.
Exactly. They intensified everything. More focus on fishing, trapping birds, hunting deer and boar, and gathering nuts, seeds, and shellfish. And their toolkit reflects this shift towards efficiency and smaller targets. This is where Mode 5 technology, the microliths, becomes crucial.
Microliths, those tiny stone pieces, how did they work? They weren't used on their own, were they?
No, that's the key. Microliths are tiny, geometrically shaped pieces of stone triangles, crescents, trapezoids. They were designed as interchangeable components for composite tools. Think of them like razor blade inserts. They'd be set into grooves in a handle or shaft made of wood, bone, or antler, and held in place with resin or bitumen.
So you could make things like arrows with sharp tips and barbs, or sickles for cutting grasses, or knives with serrated edges.
Precisely. It offered huge advantages. Mechanical leverage from the handle. Replaceable parts. If one microlift broke, you just swapped it out. You didn't have to make a whole new tool. It allowed for specialized tools like harpoons with multiple barbs, arrows designed for specific game, and efficient reaping tools for harvesting wild cereals, which became increasingly important. It's like early modular technology.
In this period of intense adaptation and maybe resource pressure, this is also when we see the first solid evidence of something darker. Organized warfare.
Unfortunately, yes. The site known as Cemetery 117 at Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, dating to the Mesolithic period, shows compelling evidence of violence. Many individuals buried there have multiple projectile points embedded in their bones, suggesting conflict, possibly ambushes or raids between groups competing for resources along the Nile.
And this foreshadows later depictions of conflict we see in art.
It does. There's famous Mesolithic rock art in Spain, like the panel known as the Marching Warriors at Cingle de la Mola, which seems to depict organized bands of archers clashing. It suggests conflict was becoming a more structured part of life in some areas.
Okay, so the Mesolithic is this intense period of adaptation, and it leads eventually, in some places quite quickly, to the biggest transformation of all, the Neolithic Revolution.
Yes. If there's one event in the entire Stone Age that fundamentally reshaped humanity, this is it. The Neolithic Revolution is the shift from getting food, hunting, gathering, to producing food, farming, herding. It starts independently in different parts of the world. The earliest is in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, around maybe 9,000, 7,000 BC, with the domestication of wheat, barley, sheep, and goats. Later, you get rice domestication in East Asia, maize and squash in Mesoamerica, potatoes in the Andes, and so on.
And this shift to farming brings a whole suite of new technologies and social changes. What are the key markers archaeologists look for?
Several things signal the Neolithic package. One big one is pottery. Once you're producing surplus food, you need ways to store it, protect it from pests and moisture. Pottery vessels are perfect for that, and also for cooking grains. Another is a change in stone tool technology. While chipped stone continues, we see the rise of ground and polished stone tools. Things like axes and adzes made by grinding against an abrasive rock to create a smooth, durable edge. These were much better for felling trees and shaping wood for building permanent houses. And you also get specialized ground stone tools like querns or grinding stones, essential for processing cereal grains into flour.
Farming means staying in one place, Stidentism, and that allows for, well, bigger projects.
Exactly. Permanent settlement opens the door to large-scale construction that hunter-gatherers simply couldn't undertake. We see the first fortified towns, like Jericho, with its massive stone walls and tower, appearing very early in the Neolithic. We see the beginnings of monumental architecture, like the early phases of Stonehenge in Britain, or Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which might even predate widespread agriculture, and then amazing structures like the Agantija temples in Malta, built between 3600 and 2500 BC, huge, complex stone temples that are among the oldest freestanding buildings in the world.
And we even get glimpses into surprisingly sophisticated village life, like at Skara Brae.
Skara Brae in Scotland is just incredible. It's Europe's best preserved Neolithic village, dating to around 3100, 2500 BC. Because it was quickly buried by sand, the preservation is amazing. The houses are semi-subterranean, connected by passages, and inside they use stone slabs to build furniture dressers, beds, storage boxes, and perhaps most astonishingly, they seem to have had a form of indoor sanitation with drains built under the floors connecting to a larger drainage system.
Indoor plumbing in the Neolithic. That's amazing. Now, with settled life, surplus food, maybe specialized crafts, does this lead to social hierarchy? Did Neolithic societies have rulers and elites, or were they still fairly egalitarian?
That's a huge area of debate among anthropologists and archaeologists. The picture is complex and varied. Many early Neolithic farming villages seem pretty egalitarian. The houses are all roughly the same size, not much difference in burials. It suggests fairly communal, kin-based societies.
Yep.
However, as populations grew, settlements became larger, trade networks developed, and some individuals or families might have accumulated more wealth or influence, maybe through controlling better land or specializing in crafts or taking on leadership roles in managing irrigation or defending the village.
So signs of inequality start to creep in.
In many places, yes, especially later in the Neolithic. We start to see differences in house size, the appearance of more elaborate burials with richer grave goods for certain individuals, and the construction of monuments that might indicate the power of emerging elites. So, while Paleolithic hunter-gatherer groups were often necessarily quite egalitarian, Neolithic societies probably laid the groundwork for the more pronounced social stratification we see later in the Bronze Age and beyond. It's likely they were, on average, more hierarchical than the societies they replaced, even if not universally so. We often picture Stone Age people just huddled in caves, but their ingenuity in building shelters was actually quite remarkable right from the early stages.
Yeah, you mentioned Homo habilis, making simple structures maybe 2 million years ago.
That's right. Some of the earliest evidence from sites like Olduvai Gorge suggests simple rings of stones, maybe used to weigh down the edges of branches or hides, leaned together to create a basic windbreak or shelter. Very rudimentary, but it's a start purpose-built structures. Fast forward to the Upper Paleolithic, and the sophistication is incredible. Take the site of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic around 23,000 BC. They found the remains of structures built with a framework of timber posts, walls made of packed clay blocks, possibly a skin roof supported by the timber. Some were quite substantial dwellings.
And then there are those shelters made from, well, the bones of the biggest animals they hunted.
The mammoth bone huts. These are truly extraordinary. Found mainly in Eastern Europe and Siberia, dating to the Upper Paleolithic Ice Age. People were using the massive bones and tusks of woolly mammoths as the primary building material. Skulls formed foundations, large leg bones and tusks created arched frameworks, possibly covered with hides. Some huts used the remains of dozens of mammoths. It speaks volumes about their hunting success, their engineering skills, and the level of social cooperation needed to build something like that.
Just amazing. And for more mobile groups, they had sophisticated portable shelters too.
Definitely. We have evidence for well-constructed tents. For example, at Plateau Perrin in France, archaeologists found traces of a large tent structure made from animal hides, dating back to the Magdalenian period, maybe 15,000 to 10,000 BC. So they adapted their shelter technology to their lifestyle and environment.
Let's switch focus a bit to their inner lives. What can we glean from their art and symbolism? This really seems to take off in the Upper Paleolithic.
It really does. Prehistoric art falls into two main categories: portable art, things like figurines, engraved tools, and parietal art, which is art on rock surfaces, mainly cave walls. The Paleolithic cave paintings are probably the most famous. Think of places like Chauvet Cave in France, with paintings dating back maybe 6,000 years, or Lascaux in Altamira, with their incredible depictions of animals like bison, horses, rhinos, lions.
What's striking is how realistic the animals often are, but human figures are usually rare and weird.
That's true. Human figures are uncommon, and when they do appear, they're often very stylized, simplified, or sometimes these strange half-human, half-animal composite figures, sometimes called the thorianthropes. Handprints and geometric signs like dots and lines are also common.
What do we think it all means? Hunting magic, storytelling, star charts.
Honestly, we don't know for sure. All those theories have been proposed, and maybe elements of all of them are true in different contexts. Some argue it was related to shamanic rituals and altered states of consciousness. Others see it as information storage, maybe marking hunting grounds or migration routes. The idea of them being related to calendars or astronomy is intriguing too, especially with those abstract symbols often appearing alongside animals. Could they be tracking seasons or lunar cycles? It's highly speculative, but fascinating.
The art changes later on. in the Mesolithic and Neolithic.
Yes, the style and themes shift. We mentioned the Mesolithic art in Spain becoming more narrative, focusing on human activities like hunting, dancing, and fighting like those marching warriors. Then, in the Neolithic, while painting continues, we see a huge rise in petroglyphs. These are images created by carving, engraving, or pecking into rock surfaces rather than painting on them. They're found worldwide. Famous examples include the Sydney rock engravings in Australia or the Bhimbetka rock shelters in India. Neolithic petroglyphs often feature more abstract or symbolic imagery, geometric patterns, cut marks, depictions of agriculture or settlements. It might reflect a growing need for marking territory, recording genealogies, or communicating more complex social information in settled societies.
So clearly, life wasn't just about finding food and staying warm. There was symbolism, ritual, belief.
Absolutely. The effort invested in things like art, and especially in burial practices, tells us their lives were rich with meaning beyond mere survival. Intentional burial, often with grave goods like tools, ornaments, or ochre, goes way back into the Middle Paleolithic with Neanderthals and becomes even more elaborate with modern humans.
And this commitment to the dead, to ancestors maybe, culminates in those massive stone structures of the later Stone Age, the megaliths.
Exactly. The megalithic phenomenon, mainly in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age across Europe, is powerful evidence of complex belief systems and social organization. We're talking about huge structures built from massive stones, megaliths. These include collective tombs like the multi-chambered passage graves found in Ireland or Brittany, and also simpler but still impressive single-chambered tombs called dolmens, basically a burial chamber made of huge upright stones capped with a massive slab. You find these across Europe and even into Asia.
The effort involved in moving and erecting those stones, it's staggering.
It really is. Quarrying those multi-ton blocks, transporting them often long distances without wheels or draft animals, and then lifting them into place, it required immense coordinated community effort, likely over generations. It speaks to deeply held beliefs about death, ancestry, and perhaps the community's connection to the landscape itself. It's the architecture of belief, made tangible in stone. #tag outro.
What an incredible span of time. If we try to boil down this deep dive, I guess the first takeaway is just that scale, isn't it? 3.4 million years, 99% of our technological story. From a simple chipped pebble, a Mode 1 flake.
All the way through the planned symmetry of the Mode 2 Acheulean biface, the ingenious composite tools made with Mode 5 microliths in the Mesolithic.
And culminating in the polished stone axes, the pottery, the grinding stones, and the massive megalithic constructions that came with the Neolithic agricultural revolution.
And it's crucial to remember those different frameworks. The European Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic sequence doesn't fit everywhere. We need the African earlier, middle, and later Stone Age system to understand the unique trajectories there, like the emphasis on herding and that direct jump from stone to iron in many places.
It's a period that often gets reduced to, the cartoon caveman image in popular culture, which needs a quick fact check, right?
Absolutely. Just to be clear for everyone listening, humans and non-avian dinosaurs never met. The Flintstones got it wrong. There's about a 66 million year gap between the last dinosaurs and the very earliest potential hominins. The real Stone Age story, with its incredible innovation and adaptation, is far more amazing than any cartoon.
It really is the story of us becoming, us. The foundations of everything were laid down then, from needing a sharp edge to figuring out how to build temples, villages, maybe even, as we heard, indoor plumbing.
And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. The Stone Age gets its name, fundamentally, from a material absence, the lack of smelted metal. It's defined by what came after. So think about our own time. What materials define us now? Is it the Silicon Age, the Plastic Age, the Information Age? If future archaeologists look back at us centuries or millennia from now, what material or lack thereof will define our era? How will they interpret the traces we leave behind, especially when so much of our material is digital and ephemeral?
That's a fascinating question, and it underscores just how much we don't know, how much is lost from that first 99% of our story. It really should inspire us to keep looking, keep exploring, maybe ask yourself, what is truly essential human trade art complex society warfare ritual emerged earliest? And what was the key spark, the technological or cognitive breakthrough that made it possible? Lots to think about. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to take those really complex, sometimes thorny concepts from history, the ones people talk about but maybe don't fully grasp, and, well, pull them apart, see what they really were.
And what shadow they still cast today, right?
Exactly. And today, our focus is on one of the big ones. Intellectually charged, definitely politically toxic for, what, the last 150 years?
You could say that. We're talking about social Darwinism.
Social Darwinism, yeah. It's a name that's infamous, but it's also widely misunderstood and, frankly, often pinned on the wrong people entirely.
That's true. It's an idea that proved incredibly malleable.
Malleable is a good word. I mean, think about it used to justify everything from, like, robber baron capitalism in the Gilded Age.
All the way to state-sponsored genocide in the 20th century.
Yeah.
It's got a truly staggering range.
It does. So that's our mission for this deep dive, right? To navigate that legacy carefully.
Precisely. 3 main goals, I think. First, we need to define it properly. What is social Darwinism? Importantly, as a set of pseudoscientific theories.
Okay, pseudoscientific, that's key.
Definitely. And we need to trace where it actually came from, its intellectual roots. Because, spoiler alert, it actually pops up before Darwin's big work on evolution.
Which is wild, given the name. Okay, so origins, what else?
Second, we'll look at how this idea got used, or maybe misused, across the globe. Economics, politics, race, empire building, it's everywhere. And often destructively so.
Right, the applications.
And finally, we need to cover the pushback. The strong criticisms based on actual science that led to it being discredited. And interestingly, Charles Darwin himself was part of that critique.
Okay, that sets the stage. So let's start with that definition. People hear social Darwinism, they think. What? Ruthlessness.
Yeah.
Cutthroat competition.
Usually something along those lines, yeah. But more formally, it's a collection of theories, again, pseudoscientific, that try to apply biological concepts to human society.
Concepts like?
Well, the big ones are natural selection, and especially that very catchy phrase, survival of the fittest. They took these ideas, often in a really simplistic way, and it slapped them onto sociology, economics, politics.
So treating human society less like a complex web and more like a jungle, a constant battle for resources.
That's a good way to put it, a battleground. The fundamental belief, the really brutal core of almost every flavor of social Darwinism is this.
Go on.
That the people or groups seen as strong and who gets labeled strong is very flexible. Well, they should see their wealth and power grow. It's natural.
And the flip side, the weak.
The weak are supposed to see their power and wealth shrink or, disappear entirely, because this whole painful process is seen as necessary.
Necessary for what? For the progress of the species or the society.
Exactly. That's the justification. It's a harsh sorting mechanism that supposedly benefits the whole group in the long run.
And you mentioned how flexible the definitions of strong and weak are. That seems crucial.
Oh, absolutely critical. It could be individual businessmen duking it out in the market. It could be political parties. It could be nations vying for global dominance.
Or, and this is where it gets darkest, it could be applied to race or ethnicity.
Precisely. That's where it had its most horrific applications. But we really need to stress this point up front for you listening.
Please do.
Social Darwinism, as a framework, is scientifically baseless and ethically bankrupt today. Its intellectual standing really collapsed after World War I.
And then the nail in the coffin came after World War II.
Definitely. The scientific community completely rejected its claims, especially those around scientific racism and eugenics.
Largely because of its undeniable links to the horrors of that era.
Right.
Fascism, Nazism, the Holocaust.
Absolutely. You can't separate the idea from those atrocities. It provided a pseudo-scientific justification for them. It's fundamentally tied to that 20th century tragedy.
Okay, so let's dig into the origins. Because the name itself, social Darwinism, is where a lot of the confusion starts, isn't it?
It really is. Because most scholars today agree this ideology isn't some necessary consequence of Darwin's actual biological theories.
In fact, Darwin's own views on humans often went against it.
Exactly. We'll get into that later, but his thoughts on sympathy and cooperation point in a very different direction than most social Darwinists took things.
So the name is kind of a historical accident, or maybe a misnomer.
It's a historical mess, honestly. The broader term Darwinism came about pretty quickly after On the Origin of Species. Thomas Henry Huxley coined it in 1861.
Okay, but that's just Darwinism. What about the specific phrase, social Darwinism?
That's where it gets weirdly specific, almost funny. Its first known appearance in print is, well, not what you'd expect.
Do tell. Where did it first show up?
It was in 1877, an article by a guy named Joseph Fisher called The History of Landholding in Ireland.
Ireland. Landholding. That doesn't sound like captains of industry or master races.
Not at all. Fisher was talking about ancient Irish social structures, things like borrowing livestock, land tenure systems. He was actually arguing against a theory that Irish chiefs had naturally evolved into feudal barons.
So he used the phrase.
He wrote something like, he could find nothing in old Irish law to warrant this theory of social Darwinism. He was using it critically to dismiss an idea about social evolution he thought was wrong.
Wait, so the first recorded use of social Darwinism was basically about borrowing cows in medieval Ireland and used negatively.
Pretty much. It really highlights how loaded the term became later and how disconnected its origins were from, say, 20th century politics.
And it also flags that other key point you made earlier.
That the term social Darwinism has almost always been used pejoratively.
Exactly. As a criticism, an insult thrown by opponents.
That's right. Very few people we now label social Darwinists actually use that term for themselves. For a long, long time, you barely saw it in academic writing in English.
But that changed dramatically, thanks to one American historian in particular.
You're thinking of Richard Hofstadter.
Yeah.
Absolutely. His 1944 book, Social Darwinism in American Thought, was massively influential.
1944. So
Yeah.
right in the middle of World War II. That timing seems important.
It was crucial. The U.S. was fighting fascism, Nazism. Hofstadter consciously used social Darwinism as an ideological weapon.
How so? He took this obscure term and did what with it?
He essentially broadened it. He used it to label a whole complex of ideas from the American Gilded Age and Europe, ideas promoting fierce competition, racism, nationalism. He tied them all together under this banner.
And link them implicitly or explicitly to the ideologies the U.S. was fighting against.
Explicitly, he framed it as a reactionary creed, the intellectual ancestor, in some ways, of the fascism they were battling. Hofstadter didn't invent the phrase, but he absolutely popularized it and gave it the negative meaning it mostly carries today.
Okay, so if Darwin isn't the real intellectual father, despite the name, who is? Who are the key figures whose ideas actually form the bedrock of what Hofstadter later called social Darwinism?
The main figure, the one most strongly associated with it now, has to be Herbert Spencer.
Herbert Spencer.
And here's the kicker, the really crucial bit of timing. Spencer published his major evolutionary ideas, like his essay Progress, its law and cause, back in 1857.
1857, so that's before Darwin.
2 full years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. Spencer was already thinking in evolutionary terms, but it wasn't Darwin's specific mechanism.
So what was Spencer's mechanism?
It was heavily influenced by Lamarckism, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory.
Lamarckism.
Yeah.
That's the idea that traits acquired during life can be passed on to offspring, right? Like a giraffe stretching its neck and its babies inheriting longer necks.
Exactly. And that's a critical difference from Darwin's natural selection. For Spencer, this meant that if you struggled, adapted, maybe got rich through business.
That acquired characteristic of success, or the traits that led to it, could be biologically inherited by your kids.
That was the implication.
Yeah.
So individual effort, ruthless competition in the market, these weren't just economically useful, they were seen as biologically progressive. They literally improved the human stock over generations.
Which gives the sort of moral justification to extreme capitalism.
Absolutely. Spencer used these ideas to argue for extreme laissez-faire capitalism. He thought any interference, like welfare, messed with this natural upward evolutionary process driven by struggle.
And he also crumbed that phrase, didn't he? The one everyone associates with Darwin, but wasn't originally his.
He did. Survival of the fittest. That was Spencer, writing about his evolutionary ideas before Darwin. Darwin did adopt it later in other editions of his book, acknowledging Spencer, kind of as a shorthand for natural selection. But Spencer used it first in this evolutionary context.
Okay, so Spencer is key, predating Darwin's origin. Who else forms the intellectual foundation here? We can't ignore Thomas Malthus, surely.
No, Malthus is absolutely fundamental. His essay on the principle of population from way back in 1798 basically set the stage.
How so? What was his core argument?
Malthus argued that population, if unchecked, grows geometrically, like 2, 4, 8, 16, while the food supply only grows arithmetically 1, 2, 3, 4.
Meaning population will always outstrip resources.
Inevitably, leading to what he called the Malthusian catastrophe. Poverty, famine, war. These weren't policy failures. They were natural, unavoidable checks on population growth. The weakest would simply starve.
That's a bleak outlook. And later, social Darwinists just loved this idea.
They built on it. It provided the perfect justification for why helping the poor was not just futile, but actually bad.
How did Malthus frame that?
He argued that things like charity or the poor laws in England just allowed more unfit people to survive and reproduce, ultimately making the resource problem worse and delaying the inevitable harsher correction.
So intervening to help was actually morally wrong in his view, because it interfered with nature's grim but necessary balancing act.
That was the argument. It gave a philosophical license for indifference, even cruelty, framing it as alignment with natural law.
Okay, so let's recap the intellectual lineage here. Malthus sets up the idea of inevitable scarcity and struggle. Then Spencer, before Darwin's origin, applies a Lamarckian evolutionary framework to society, stressing competition and coining survival of the fittest.
Right. And then decades later, Hofstadter comes along during WWII, takes this mix of ideas, gives it the catchy negative label social Darwinism, and solidifies its link, fairly or unfairly, to Darwin's biological theory.
It really is a conceptual matchup with a complicated history.
Now, once we understand those roots, we run into the next big complication. Social Darwinism wasn't one single coherent philosophy. It was all over the place.
That seems odd. If the core idea is survival of the fittest, shouldn't that lead to pretty consistent political views, like always favoring competition?
You'd think so, but no. The historical record shows the opposite. As the concise Oxford Dictionary of Politics points out, just because someone believed in biological selection didn't mean they agreed on politics. The commitment entailed nothing uniform.
So how did that play out? Give us some examples.
Well, you could have a social Darwinist who was a hardcore defender of laissez-faire capitalism, minimal government, maximum individual competition. Think Spencer or William Graham Sumner in the U.S.
Okay, that fits the stereotype.
But then you could also have a social Darwinist who argued for state socialism. Someone who believed the state needed to actively manage society, maybe even control breeding, to ensure the fittest prevailed as a collective group.
Wait, state control versus total free market, both justified by the same core idea? How does that work?
The common thread was the goal. Selection and improvement of the group, however defined. The method, individual liberty or state control, was secondary. They just disagreed on who should be doing the selecting or what environment best facilitated it. The fittest could be the best individual capitalist, or it could be the best managed socialist state.
That flexibility must have made it incredibly appealing to ideologues across the spectrum.
Absolutely. You could tailor it to almost any political project that involved competition or hierarchy.
Let's pivot to the application that really tried to bridge the biological and the social directly. Eugenics.
Right, eugenics. The idea and practice of trying to improve the human species by controlling who reproduces. This was formally founded by Sir Francis Galton.
Who was, fascinatingly, Charles Darwin's cousin.
He was indeed. Galton started publishing his ideas in the 1860s. His core argument was that mental qualities, things like intelligence, talent, even morality, were inherited just like physical traits.
And therefore subject to natural selection or interference with it.
Exactly. And Galton became very worried about modern society.
What was his specific concern?
He looked at things like welfare programs, hospitals, asylums for the mentally ill, institutions designed to help the vulnerable, and he argued these were disastrous from an evolutionary perspective.
Why disastrous?
Because they allowed people he considered inferior humans, the sick, the feeble-minded, the poor, to survive and reproduce, often, he claimed, at higher rates than the superior members of society.
He feared society was basically breeding downward, degrading the human stock.
That was his fear, a demographic decline in quality. So he proposed eugenics as the solution, either positive eugenics, encouraging the fit to have more children, or negative eugenics, preventing the unfit from reproducing at all.
Which sounds chillingly predictive of later policies. But there's an important caveat about Galton and even Darwin here, right? Regarding the role of the state.
A very important one. While Galton theorized about eugenics, and Darwin was aware of these ideas, neither of them actually advocated for the state to step in and forcibly control reproduction.
Why not, if they believed in the theory?
It seems to stem from what historians call their Whiggish distrust of government.
Meaning, what's a Whiggish distrust?
It's basically rooted in classical liberalism, a deep skepticism about giving the central government too much power. They might have believed in the principles of selection, but they fundamentally distrusted the state's competence and moral authority to be the one making those life and death decisions about who gets to breed.
So they're worried about government overreach, even in service of a goal they theoretically supported.
Exactly. They feared giving the state that kind of power could lead to tyranny or abuse. It was a philosophical break that, unfortunately, later eugenicists didn't have.
Their successors had no such qualms, leading directly to forced sterilizations and worse in the 20th century.
Tragically, yes.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, let's talk about Friedrich Nietzsche. He's often thrown into the mix, maybe because of the Übermensch or Superman idea. But was he really a straightforward social Darwinist?
Not at all, actually. His relationship with Darwinism was complex, often critical. He certainly talked about selection and creating higher types of humans, but he pushed back hard against the simplistic ideas of Spencer or Ernst Haeckel and other popular German evolutionists.
How was Nietzsche's view different?
Well, he fundamentally disagreed with the idea that weakness or sickness was only a negative, something to be eliminated for progress.
He saw value in weakness.
In a way, yes. He criticized Spencer and Darwin for, as he saw it, misunderstanding strength. Nietzsche argued that sometimes overcoming a weakness, a limitation, or an illness could actually forge a stronger, more complex individual.
Can you give an example of what he meant?
He wrote something like, "The strongest natures retain the type, the weaker ones help to advance it." He suggested, for instance, that a blind person might develop deeper inward sight or better hearing as a compensation.
So the struggle against internal weakness, not just external competition, was key for him, linked to his idea of the will to power as self-overcoming.
Precisely. It wasn't just about the physically dominant eliminating the unsuccessful, like in Spencer's view. It was about transcending limitations, including one's own. It's a much more nuanced psychological take than typical social Darwinism.
That's a really important distinction. And it ties into another seeming contradiction you mentioned earlier, even among people who did broadly accept social Darwinist ideas in the early 20th century.
Yes, the surprising support for social reforms.
Right. You said that while the strict Malthusians would say, let the poor starve, many early 20th century social Darwinists actually supported things like better wages or working conditions. Why? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but their logic was, well, strategic, if chilling. They weren't doing it out of pure compassion. They wanted to level the playing field slightly.
To what end?
To make the selection process fairer, in their view. If you improve basic conditions, give the poor a fighting chance, then you can more clearly distinguish between those who fail because of bad luck or circumstances.
And those who fail, in their eyes, because of inherent biological inferiority, laziness, or weakness.
Exactly. By removing the environmental excuses, they felt they could more confidently identify the truly unfit. It wasn't about abandoning selection, it was about refining the criteria to make later eugenic arguments or justifications for inequality seem more robust and scientific.
Wow. So improving conditions was actually a step towards justifying elimination or control later on. That's incredibly calculating.
It reveals how deeply embedded the selection idea was, even when it appeared they were advocating for social improvements.
So whatever the theoretical debates or inconsistencies, when these ideas hit the real world, especially the world of power and money, they seemed to lose all nuance, didn't they?
They absolutely did. They became powerful tools for justification, and nowhere was this clearer early on than in the United States during the Gilded Age.
The era of massive industrial growth, huge fortunes, and cutthroat competition after the Civil War, sometimes called commercial Darwinism.
That's a great term for it, yeah. The conditions were perfect. You had these captains of industry, or robber barons, depending on your view, accumulating immense wealth, and social Darwinism gave them a kind of moral and scientific cover.
It framed their success not as greed, but as what? The inevitable outcome of natural law.
Precisely. The most famous quote capturing this comes from John D. Rockefeller, head of Standard Oil.
What did Rockefeller say?
He said, "The growth of a large business is merely a survival of the fittest, the working out of a law of nature and a law of God."
Wow. So my monopoly isn't predatory. It's basically ordained by biology and divinity. That's quite the defense.
It perfectly shows how they co-opted the language. And this view had academic champions, too, like William Graham Sumner at Yale. He was a huge promoter of Spencer's ideas in America.
Sumner. What was his main argument?
He wrote a very influential pamphlet in 1883 called "What Social Classes Owe to Each Other." His answer, absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
Nothing. He was fiercely against any government aid, any charity, arguing it just coddled the weak, encouraged them to reproduce, and would eventually weaken the whole nation. He basically saw the successful American businessman as the pinnacle of evolutionary fitness.
Okay, but here's that contradiction again. If Sumner and Spencer preached this hard line, "Oh, nothing, let the weak fail," How do we square that with someone like Andrew Carnegie?
Ah, Carnegie, the great paradox. He admired Spencer, quoted him, believed in the struggle.
But then he gave away almost his entire fortune, building libraries, universities, concert halls. He wrote The Gospel of Wealth, arguing the rich had a duty to redistribute their money.
Exactly. It completely contradicts the anti-philanthropic core of Sumner's or Spencer's strictest interpretations.
So what's the explanation? Were they just hypocrites? Or did they not really buy the ideology fully?
Historians lean towards the idea that the rhetoric of social Darwinism was incredibly useful for justifying their business methods, crushing competitors, keeping wages low. It provided psychological armor.
But when it came to the actual implications, letting the poor starve, many of them balked. Their actions didn't match the harshest version of the theory.
It seems so. It suggests social Darwinism was often more of a convenient post hoc justification than a deeply held, consistently applied moral code for many of these figures.
Okay, moving from the boardroom to the world map. The same logic of struggle and fitness was applied on a global scale, wasn't it, to justify imperialism?
Oh, massively. Starting around the 1870s, the era of new imperialism, social Darwinism became a go-to explanation for why Western powers were colonizing vast parts of Africa and Asia.
How did that argument work?
Thinkers like Benjamin Kidd talked about the Anglo-Saxon and Latin overflowing his boundaries. It was framed as a natural biological imperative for stronger, fitter civilizations to expand.
And the subjugation or disappearance of indigenous peoples.
Was seen as regrettable, perhaps, but ultimately just the natural outcome of competition between stronger and weaker races. It wasn't the fault of the colonizers. It was just nature weeding out the less fit.
So white Europeans, especially those from powerful industrial nations, were defined as inherently superior, biologically destined to rule.
That was the core message. It created this potent racial hierarchy, justifying conquest and exploitation not as aggression, but as evolutionary progress.
And this framing of life is a zero-sum struggle between entire groups that laid the groundwork for some truly horrific events in the 20th century. We have to talk about those links explicitly, starting maybe with the Ottoman Empire.
Yes, the Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress who took power in the declining Ottoman Empire. They were deeply influenced by social Darwinist thinking.
How did they apply it?
They saw their geopolitical situation, the empire crumbling, surrounded by rivals as an existential life-or-death struggle between Turks and other ethnic groups within the empire, like Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians.
And this worldview fueled.
It provided a direct ideological justification for the genocides and ethnic cleansing campaigns they carried out, most infamously the Armenian genocide starting in 1915.
They saw eliminating entire populations as necessary for national survival.
Exactly. In their social Darwinist mindset, killing civilians, including women and children, the future generations of competing groups, wasn't a war crime. It was a necessary and justified course of action to secure the Turkish nation's place in the struggle for existence, removing competitors entirely.
That's chilling. And then, of course, the most notorious example, Nazi Germany.
Nazi ideology was absolutely saturated with social Darwinist ideas. They fused it with their own virulent pseudoscientific theories of racial hierarchy, the Aryans or Nordics as the master race.
So for the Nazis, life wasn't just struggle, it was racial struggle.
Fundamentally, the state's entire purpose, in their view, was to promote the victory of the Aryan race in this constant battle. Everything else was secondary.
And they pushed this message hard through propaganda.
Relentlessly. They made films with titles like Alles Leben ist Kampf. All life is struggle. Hitler himself apparently encouraged internal conflict among his own officials, believing the stronger faction would naturally prevail and produce better outcomes. A kind of internal corporate Darwinism, but within the Nazi state.
And the social policies that flowed from this were horrific, targeting those deemed unfit within their own society.
Absolutely. Their social Darwinist beliefs meant they opposed social welfare that might sustain the weak, and it directly led to programs like Action T4.
The involuntary euthanasia program.
Yes. Systematically murdering tens of thousands of mentally ill and disabled Germans, people they labeled life unworthy of life, a biological drain on the master race. This direct line from social Darwinist thought to state-sponsored mass murder is the main reason it's so utterly condemned today.
It's important to remember, too, that these ideas spread globally, taking unique forms even outside Europe and America. What about Asia?
Yes, the influence was significant there too. In China, for instance, social Darwinism arrived largely through translations of Western thinkers, particularly Thomas Henry Huxley's work, translated by a very influential scholar named Yan Fu in the late 19th century.
But Yan Fu added his own spin.
He did. He added lots of annotations, drawing heavily on Herbert Spencer's more competitive ideas. So, the version that reached the Chinese intelligentsia was very much the struggle for survival version.
How did Yan Fu summarize it?
His summary was stark. Peoples and living things struggle for survival. The weak invariably become the prey of the strong. And this message really resonated in China at the time.
Why then?
Because China was facing intense pressure from Western imperial powers and a rising Japan. Intellectuals were desperate for theories that explained China's perceived weakness and offered a path to national strengthening. Social Darwinism seemed to provide that brutal diagnosis and prescription.
Did this lead to specific policy proposals?
It certainly fueled calls for radical national reform, including eugenics. Some Chinese sociologists, like Pan Gongdan, even made the quite radical suggestion that Chinese people should intermarry with Europeans or Japanese groups seen as fitter to quickly improve the nation's genetic stock.
Wow. That's a fascinating, if troubling, application. Even Chiang Kai-shek referenced these ideas.
Yes, during his New Life movement in the 1930s, he talked about the need for constant struggle and readaptation, echoing social Darwinist themes of national renewal through effort.
And Japan also influenced.
Very much so. From the late 19th century onwards, as Japan rapidly modernized and became an imperial power itself, social Darwinist ideas, mixed with Galton's eugenics and Lamarckian concepts, became influential in politics, public health debates, and social movements. They provided a ready-made justification for both internal social control and external expansion.
Okay, we've traced the destructive path of this idea across the globe. Let's circle back now to the core scientific critique. Why is it pseudoscientific? And how did Darwin's actual work undermine it?
Well, the main scientific rejection rests on a few key points. First, social Darwinists massively overemphasized competition and conveniently ignored the huge role of cooperation in evolution, something Darwin himself recognized.
Okay, so it's a selective reading of biology.
Highly selective. Second, the whole basis of eugenics and scientific racism. The idea that you could clearly rank races or groups as biologically superior or inferior has been completely debunked by modern genetics. There's just no scientific foundation for it.
Let's focus on Darwin again. What did he actually say about human society and morality developing?
Darwin, especially in The Descent of Man, argued that things like sympathy, mutual aid, a sense of morality, what he called social instincts, weren't just cultural niceties. He believed they actually evolved through natural selection.
Because they helped the group survive.
Exactly. He wrote quite clearly that communities which had the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring.
So for Darwin, cooperation wasn't weakness. It was actually a key survival strategy. The fittest group might be the most helpful group.
That's the implication. It's a radically different picture from Spencer's vision of just atomized individuals clawing their way to the top. Darwin saw the adaptive advantage of solidarity.
Which leads us perfectly into the major philosophical counter-argument, right? From Peter Kropotkin.
Ah, yes. Peter Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist prince. His 1902 book, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, is a landmark critique.
What was Kropotkin's core argument against the Spencerian view of nature as just red in tooth and claw?
Kropotkin, drawing on lots of examples from the animal kingdom and human history, argued that cooperation, or mutual aid, was just as important, if not more important, a factor in evolution as competition.
He essentially said Darwin himself acknowledged this.
He did. Kropotkin pointed out that the fittest often aren't the strongest individuals, but those who are best at working together. He argued that in countless animal societies, mutual support sharing food, warning of danger, collective defense is what ensures survival far more than individual struggle.
So, competition within a species might be destructive, but cooperation within the species against external challenges is key.
That was his point. He saw mutual aid as the primary engine of evolutionary success, especially for humans. He believed our ability to build cooperative social systems was our greatest strength.
Which, of course, fit perfectly with his anarchist politics.
Yeah.
He saw states and hyper-competitive capitalism as sort of unnatural barriers to this cooperative human potential.
Pretty much. He used evolutionary biology to argue against the systems social Darwinists were defending, claiming they hindered, rather than helped, our evolved capacity for cooperation. It was a brilliant way to turn the tables using Darwin's own broader insights.
It really highlights that survival of the fittest can mean fittest to cooperate, not just fittest to dominate.
A crucial distinction.
But just to show again how flexible this core idea of struggle was, it wasn't always individualistic, right? Hofstadter talked about Darwinian collectivism.
Yes, that's the flip side, where the struggle isn't between individuals, but between groups, nations, races, classes, often directed by the state.
Fascism and Nazism are the obvious examples there, improving the national organism. But you mentioned a perhaps less obvious example from Britain, Fabianism.
Right, the Fabians. Early British socialists, thinkers like George Bernard Shaw, Sidney, and Beatrice Webb, they advocated for gradual, state-led social reform.
How do they connect with social Darwinism? That seems counterintuitive for socialists.
Well, some prominent Fabians were actually quite keen on using the state for a kind of collectivist eugenics. They believed deeply in the importance of innate genetic characteristics over environment or experience in determining social outcomes like poverty.
So they wanted the state to manage breeding to improve the population.
Some definitely leaned that way. They saw it as a rational, scientific way to improve society and reduce poverty by ensuring only the genetically fit, reproduced, managed through state planning. It was a sort of top-down, bureaucratic, social Darwinism aimed at socialist ends.
It's just fascinating and disturbing how this one core idea, selection through struggle, could be twisted to support laissez-faire capitalism, state socialism, fascism, imperialism, pretty much any ideology that involved ranking groups.
Its adaptability was perhaps its most dangerous quality. Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've seen social Darwinism emerge as this really tangled, often contradictory set of ideas. It's got a name problem, being unfairly tied exclusively to Darwin.
Right, and it was mostly used as a negative label by its opponents.
Exactly. But despite its scientific flaws, its influence was just immense. It offered this seemingly scientific justification for everything from Gilded Age inequalities to colonial conquest.
And ultimately to the horrific genocides of the 20th century.
Which is why it's now so thoroughly discredited academically and morally.
But is it really gone? The term social Darwinism might be taboo, but do the underlying concepts still linger?
I think they absolutely do, especially in the business world. You hear echoes of it constantly in what people sometimes call commercial Darwinism.
Explain that. How does it manifest today?
Well, think about how we often talk about the global marketplace. It's framed as this relentless, amoral arena. Companies are locked in a struggle for survival. They need to adapt or die. Competitors are existential threats. Market share is territory to be conquered.
That language is everywhere. Constant competition, winner take all.
It's pure Spencerian social Darwinism, just applied to corporations instead of species or races. The idea that ruthless competition is not only inevitable but somehow good, leading to innovation and efficiency, that's the direct legacy.
So understanding this history is vital because that struggle for life narrative is still incredibly powerful. It often gets presented as just the way things are, biologically or economically unavoidable.
Exactly, but the crucial takeaway, I think, goes back to Darwin himself and Kropotkin's critique. If cooperation and sympathy are also key evolutionary advantages,
Then maybe the relentless competition model isn't the only way, or even the best way.
precisely. Which leads to a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think about after this deep dive.
Laid on us.
In today's world, which seems so dominated by this aggressive commercial Darwinism, this focus on individual or corporate competition above all else, what forces are pushing back? What social mechanisms are actively encouraging mutual aid, cooperation, solidarity?
Things like international agreements, labor unions, nonprofits, open source communities.
Maybe all of those and more. The big question is, are those mechanisms of cooperation strong enough? Are they evolving fast enough to counterbalance the competitive drive and help us navigate the huge collective challenges we face in the 21st century?
That's a powerful thought to end on. Not just who is the strongest, but who is best able to work together.
A fundamental shift in perspective, drawing on the complexities Darwin himself recognized.
Well, this has been fascinating, if sobering. Thanks for guiding us through this incredibly complex and often dark history.
Glad we could unpack it.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.